I told you that we would have breaking news first if we had a verdict in Jimmy Ray Rodgers, and guess what, ladies and gentlemen, viewers from across the world, including the Bahamas, which we're now there. We have a verdict in the Jimmy Ray Rodgers case. In the courtroom, everybody is gathering. I am looking at the screen right now. I'm seeing offices, and you're looking at the screen too, going past. The judge is not on the bench. The jury is not there yet to hear the case. But let me bring my guest in just to mention it, because this is a case where Teresa Sievers, Dr. Teresa Sievers, was murdered in her house when she came back from a trip where she had been with her husband. The prosecution said the husband arranged the murder. He hired a Curtis Wright, his best friend from years, who pleaded guilty already and testified in this trial. And Curtis Wright said he was helped by Jimmy Ray Rodgers, his friend, who's also on trial. So since there was a doctor who was killed, let me bring my doctor guest into this. Dr. John Delatorre. I was going to ask you before about Markeith Lloyd, but I want to ask you about this. You followed, you know jurors, you know psychology. If there are people like hitmen, like Curtis Wright, who said, I did it, and then there's also another person, the girlfriend here, Ms. Shoemaker of Jimmy Ray Rodgers. How does the jury view these, I wouldn't say snitches, but people that have been turned by the prosecution as opposed to people who come off the street and just are eyewitnesses? How do they view them?
I think they view them in more of a you're doing the right thing kind of way. I think juries as a construct are more likely to view the positive of a person rather than the negative of a person. So they won't view them as a snitch. They'll view them as someone who's finally being able to follow their moral compass and doing the right thing.
And Dr. Delatorre, we had the jury ask for readback, okay, of the girlfriend, Taylor Shoemaker, as her name is pronounced. She was the girlfriend of Jimmy Ray Rodgers, and she said that he confessed to her while they were in bed, and she also threw out some of the jumpsuits that supposedly were put on by her boyfriend to kill Dr. Sievers. When you have a person who, like her, there's a readback from the jury, and she was also being paid by the government, why does a jury want to hear her testimony? What is it about the girlfriend or a girlfriend or somebody who lived with somebody who's a killer that they're interested in?
They're right there. They're the people that are going to see it. They're the people that are going to know it first. And in some ways, they're viewed as that secrecy container, that person that will hold all of the other person's secrets, and it's firsthand.
And let me just tell you, what you're watching on the screen right now, that is the victim's mother. That is Teresa Sievers, Dr. Teresa Sievers' mother, that is coming in, and it is her family that is affected, and supposedly the husband, according to the prosecution, who is in the box next for a trial, let's say, the prosecution said that he orchestrated it because he wanted to keep the kids, like a self-help divorce. Lisa Lockwood, you have investigated these crimes. Isn't, when you have a victim and you're talking to a victim, is it heart-wrenching as it seems to us as when we're looking at the victim on the screen?
Oh, it is. And going back to the family member and domestic situations and custody over kids, those are the most volatile. And that's when people lose all sensibility. It's all or none. They either don't want to lose their fortune or they don't want to lose their children, and they're willing to do anything at all costs, as we've seen in this case.
So let me also, Liz Crotty, you've tried murder cases. The victim here was killed 17 blows with one hammer or two hammers, a ball-peen hammer or a claw hammer. 17 blows here to the head. Does the jury hate Mr. Rodgers, who, by the way, his nickname was the Hammer?
I mean, let me just correct you. I've never tried a homicide case.
Okay, sorry about that.
Just want to be clear. But I do think what happened is they're having a competition between the cooperating witness, Mr. Wright, and Rodgers' girlfriend, of trying to get to the point of who is the most consistent in their answers. Is the girlfriend corroborating Mr. Wright's testimony, or is it conflicting it? So I think that because there was no DNA evidence on either hammer of Mr. Rodgers, so I think that unfortunately, there is a woman dead here.
Right. By the way, they didn't find one of the hammers. One of the hammers was left at the scene. One they never found.
Right. So, but there was no DNA on one of the hammers. So I think it's, listen, you're stuck with a murder for hire, essentially, to circumvent a divorce, which is always a terrible case for the defense. I mean, it's a very sympathetic case for the prosecution because this isn't bad set of circumstances, but this person is a third-party accessory, and how culpable is he when it comes to the cooperating witness?
Well, according to the testimony that we heard from both Curtis Wright and was a little bit corroborated by the girlfriend, both of them, Lisa Lockwood, both Curtis Wright, there we see the prosecutor entering the courtroom, by the way, said that Curtis Wright landed 3 blows and that Jimmy Ray Rodgers landed the other blows. Do you think the jury cares, or most of the jury cared, who landed the blows if they were both there in the house?
I don't think so. I don't. And Curtis was smart, obviously, initially going forward, lying first, but then finally saying, you know what, I did this and I just need to go forward and do the right thing and serve my time. So no, the jury doesn't care. Any of those strikes could have been the deadly one. When we learned from forensics, pathologists, the brain swelling, she could have laid there and just died from the first 3 initially. So
yeah, this is really tragic. Dr. John Delatorre, when you have jurors in the psychology of juries in a room, obviously they didn't come back right away. They've been deliberating for a while. If there is one juror who's like, well, I'm uncomfortable with Taylor Showmaker getting, $14,000, $17,000, being paid $400 a month. I'm uncomfortable with Curtis Wright, a killer, a planner, not getting the death penalty. And these things make me uncomfortable. What do other jurors generally do to bring them around to their point of view?
I think ultimately the jury comes together and asks themselves about the severity of the crime, whether the defendant appears remorseful in any way, and is the defendant dangerous looking? Like, is their actual physical appearance dangerous looking? So ultimately, the juries are going to come back as a group and ask themselves those 3 kinds of questions, and ultimately come up with their decision, both individually and then as a group.
And in the picture, we are seeing the victim's family there. As you know, the mother is in the middle. The sister is staged right on our screen. And the victim's family, they're crying. They're emotional. They're emotional, obviously, because you can't just put to rest that your loved one could have been killed by, and there she is, Dr. Sievers, who worked so hard in her life to have a family, to make her family happy, and came home. And the last question, Liz Crotty, that Dr. Sievers asked, the victim's family is there and the jury see them. She said to Curtis Wright, why? Why? I mean, can you even answer that question?
No, I mean, I think that's a loaded question, and it always goes to motive, and it's what is the motive to kill someone you don't know, and can money persuade that much? And I just think that that's really always a good question in a homicide case for the prosecution when it's not a self-defense, because I think that really hits home how hard this is for everyone involved and her family.
Well, I see them standing up 12 hours of deliberation. Let me just, I'm sorry to cut you off, Liz. The judges coming into the courtroom, again, 12 hours, about 12 hours of deliberation, just a little bit over, where the judge is smiling a little bit. I think he's happy he has a verdict. I'm wondering, he's obviously going to bring the jury in. As you know, in a courtroom, we cannot show a jury. And in some states, we can't even show the rows of people watching the trial. After the O.J. Simpson case in California, that was prohibited, but we're going to go into court now because the judge is talking to everyone. Wow, so we have to get some reaction to this. We do have a guilty verdict. We do have a guilty verdict in Jimmy Ray Rodgers, but it is of second-degree murder, not a first-degree murder. Liz Crotty, you've been watching this with me. What was the difference between the first-degree murder and the second-degree murder here?
I'm not up on the Florida homicide statutes, but I'm pretty sure in New York, a first-degree murder is a murder for hire. So the jury obviously did not think that he was part of the murder for hire plot by Dr. Sievers' husband and Mr. Wright. So he's not part of that. He did cause the murder. But interestingly enough, they did not convict him of burglary. They convicted him of trespass. So he was where he wasn't supposed to be. But burglary is when you enter a premises to commit a crime therein. So obviously, the jury bought that he was a bit of a dupe. They found him not guilty of a weapon, but they did find him guilty of murder. So I believe they feel as though he did help assist in the murder, but that he didn't know anything about it before or once going on.
And we are looking we're looking at Jimmy Ray Rodgers, who's only 29 there on the screen, whose nickname is the Hammer, and now we're looking at the family. Lisa Lockwood, I have a question for you, that if he didn't wield the hammer, go into the house with the hammer, but he knew what was going to happen, would this be sort of like what the jury has found, that he helped Curtis Ray Wright? He was part of the plan, but he wasn't the one that was wielding the hammer that killed her?
Yeah, my belief is that there was a hammer found on the premises. I believe one was brought there. So there may be some kind of discussion whether or not they believe that a hammer was brought there, because they hadn't decided on the means of which she was going to die. They knew she was going to die when they arrived. And he was going to be the dupe, as you said before. He was going to be the backup, and he did not have the intent when he went into that house and trespassed that was going to conspire. So that's my belief, is what the jury bought. They bought into that story.
Well, yeah, so it's very interesting, Dr. John Delatorre. You are the psychologist in this, and of course, we know that Jimmy Ray Rodgers' nickname is the Hammer, but this jury wasn't swayed by that type of testimony. It appears they were more swayed with the fact that maybe Curtis Wright is the bad guy and got a lesser sentence because he kind of involved Jimmy Ray Rodgers, but Jimmy Ray Rodgers really wasn't the bad guy that Curtis Wright was making him out to be. Does that sound what the jury kind of came to that conclusion?
Sounds like it. Plus, nicknames aren't always about the thing that you do or what you're known for. Sometimes it's the antithetical, that maybe he's afraid of using hammers, and so that's why they call him the Hammer. But it does seem like the jury, they thought more of Wright rather than Rodgers.
Okay, let's go into court. The judge is talking about sentencing date. So let's recap. The jury found that Jimmy Ray Rodgers was not guilty in the conspiracy to commit a murder, not guilty to conspire with Curtis Ray Wright and maybe the husband to commit the murder. They did find that he was guilty of the second-degree murder, however. They did not find he was guilty of the burglary, that he went into that household with a weapon with the intent to kill. They did find, however, that he was guilty of trespass, that he shouldn't have been in the house, and indeed, he did engage in the homicide wherein Dr. Teresa Sievers was killed. So to me, it sounds a little bit like Lisa Lockwood. The jury had some discrepancies between them. Some of them were concerned, and they didn't think that maybe he was as involved as Curtis Wright said he was. And this kind of was an agreement to, well, we know he did something, and he's going to get a big sentence anyhow, right?
Right. And Curtis ended up with second degree and 25 years and no mandatory minimum. So I believe that they knew that his role was a lot better, and maybe they thought that this was a fair exchange. Why should this guy, who wasn't the conspirator, who wasn't the one who was going to be taking money for the job, who kind of came along for the ride, why would he get a higher charge?
And Dr. John Delatorre, he is eligible for up to life in prison, however, and there's a question about whether there's going to be a pre-sentence report, whether or not they want a pre-sentence report, whether the defense wants one before the judge gives an ultimate penalty here or a verdict here, because he's not subject to the death penalty. So if there is a pre-sentence report and they find mitigating factors in that pre-sentence report, do you think he could get less than Curtis Wright or equal to Curtis Wright, since the jury sent that message that he's not as liable as Curtis Wright?
I think it's possible that he gets less, depending on what they find in the social background information. But yeah, I think it's possible that he ends up with less.
Well, you know what? We have so much again to talk about between the verdict here in Jimmy Ray Rodgers, guilty of murder in the second degree, the verdict in Markeith Floyd, no death penalty, life imprisonment. We have to go, however, to a quick break, and stay with us. We'll be right back on the Law and Crime Network.